May 24th, 1941, 6 a.m., the North Atlantic Ocean. A wall of fire erupts from the darkness. 1 shell, 2 shells, 8 shells screaming through the frozen air at 1,640 feet per second. The ocean explodes. Steam rises 100 feet high. And then silence. 8 minutes later, HMS Hood, the most powerful warship Britain had ever built, the pride of the Royal Navy, the symbol of an entire empire, is gone. Swallowed whole by the Atlantic, 1,415 men, dead, in 8 minutes. But here is the part they never put in the history books. The ship that killed HMS Hood, the ship that made the entire British Empire tremble, was now the most hunted vessel on Earth. And the men sent to destroy it had less than 24 hours to do it, or lose the war. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next videos. Join us as we continue to explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community, because history, this incredible, deserves to be told. WWII. His name was Albert Makela. He was 22 years old. He was a welder from Hamburg. He had never fired a gun in his life. He had no military training, no officer rank, no decorations. He worked in the belly of the Bismarck sealing steel plates, repairing pipes, keeping the engines alive. He was nobody. He was everybody. And on May 27, 1941, this anonymous young welder would find himself face to face with the most catastrophic decision of World War II, a decision that would determine whether 2,200 German sailors lived or died, whether Nazi Germany's most powerful weapons survived, and whether the war in the Atlantic could ever be won. By the time this story ends, 36 British warships will have converged on a single target. 480 aircraft sorties will have been launched. And the Bismarck, 41,700 tons of the most advanced naval engineering the world had ever seen, will have been reduced to a burning, sinking tomb in less than 24 hours. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why May 27th happened the way it did, you need to understand what the world looked like in May 1941, because the situation facing Britain was not just desperate, it was apocalyptic. By the spring of 1941, Germany had already conquered France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and half of North Africa. The Luftwaffe was bombing London every single night, and out in the Atlantic Ocean, that vast gray, freezing stretch of water between Britain and survival German U-boats were winning the most critical battle of the entire war. Britain is an island. That means everything: food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, steel, rubber, soldiers. Everything had to arrive by ship. If the ships stopped coming, Britain stopped fighting. It was that simple. Winston Churchill himself called the Battle of the Atlantic the dominating factor all through the war. He later admitted it was the one thing that truly frightened him. And Germany knew it. And Germany. By 1941, German submarines were sinking Allied merchant ships at a rate that defied comprehension. In 1 month, March 1941, U-boats destroyed 41 ships, 243,000 tons of supplies, gone. In April, another 195,000 tons. Britain was importing barely half of what it needed to survive. Rationing had been in place for over a year. Ordinary British civilians were eating less than 1,000 calories a day. Military planners in London were quietly, grimly calculating something unthinkable: how long until Britain had to surrender, not because of bombs, but because of starvation. And then Germany decided to make it worse. 2 German battleships, the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, had already been sent into the Atlantic in what the Kriegsmarine called Operation Berlin. In just 2 months, they sank 48 Allied vessels and destroyed 270,000 tons of shipping. The Royal Navy scrambled to stop them. They failed. The 2 German warships slipped back to port in France untouched, triumphant. The British tried everything. They sent destroyers, they sent cruisers, they repositioned their entire home fleet. Nothing worked. The German surface raiders were faster, better armored, and commanded by officers who knew exactly how to exploit the vast emptiness of the Atlantic to disappear when the Royal Navy came looking. The mood in London was beyond desperate. Members of Parliament were asking out loud whether the war could be won at all. American newspapers were openly speculating that Britain had months, not years, left to fight. Roosevelt was sympathetic, but America was officially neutral. The convoys were the lifeline, and the lifeline was being severed, ship by ship, week by week. But nobody, not the British Admiralty, not Churchill himself, nobody was prepared for what Hitler ordered next. Because the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau were just the warm-up act. The main event was the Bismarck, 41,700 tons displacement. 823 feet long, longer than 3 football fields placed end to end. 8 15-inch guns capable of hurling a 1-ton shell more than 20 miles. A top speed of 30 knots faster than anything the Royal Navy could put in the water. Armor plating up to 12 inches thick on her main belt. And a crew of 2,221 men trained to absolute perfection by the most disciplined naval force on Earth. Chi. Naval engineers who examined her specifications when she was launched called her unsinkable. Not metaphorically, literally. They calculated that to send the Bismarck to the bottom of the ocean, you would need to hit her with so many shells, so many torpedoes delivered from so many directions simultaneously, that the scenario was essentially impossible. British Naval Command agreed. Their assessment was sobering. If the Bismarck broke loose into the open Atlantic, they might not be able to stop her. She could hunt convoys for months. She could destroy hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping. She could, if everything went wrong for Britain and right for Germany, tip the balance of the Atlantic War permanently. But moitu saptaidoi, vi một người đàn ông không ai để ý, everything was about to change because of a man nobody noticed. His full name was Albert Johannes Makela. Born 1919 in a working-class neighborhood of Hamburg, the third son of a shipyard worker. His father had spent 30 years riveting steel plates onto merchant vessels in the Blohm und Voss shipyards, the same yards where years later the Bismarck herself would be built. Albert grew up breathing metal shavings and engine oil. He learned to weld before he learned to drive. He understood steel the way a musician understands sound instinctively, physically in his bones. Yeah. He was not recruited into the Kriegsmarine because of any special skill or education. He was recruited because Germany needed warm bodies to fill the lower decks of its rapidly expanding fleet. He reported for duty in January 1941, was assigned to damage control and engineering maintenance aboard the Bismarck, and spent the next 4 months learning the ship's anatomy, the way you learn a house you grew up in by feel, by memory, by the particular sound different pipes made when something was wrong. His commanding officers noticed him briefly and then forgot about him. He was quiet, efficient, not ambitious. He never attended parties thrown by the petty officers. He spent his off-duty hours in the machinery spaces, not the mess hall, running his hands along pipes and welds and checking for micro-fractures that no one else could see or feel. His one unusual quality, the quality that would matter more than anything else in the next 48 hours, was this: Albert Makela had an almost supernatural ability to understand stress fractures in metal. He could look at a welded joint and tell you from the color of the oxidation and the geometry of the weld bead exactly how much force that joint could withstand before it failed. His father had the same gift. In the civilian world, it was a useful and moderately respected skill. In the belly of a battleship, in the middle of a North Atlantic storm, it was something else entirely. It was the difference between life and death. And then, one night, before the Bismarck left port for the last time, Albert Makela discovered something. Something he knew immediately was wrong. Something he also knew with equal certainty his superiors would not want to hear. He had been inspecting the steering gear compartment, a narrow claustrophobic space deep in the Bismarck's stern, filled with hydraulic lines and the massive mechanisms that controlled her twin rudders. Standard maintenance check. Nothing unusual scheduled. But as he worked his way along the port rudder housing, his hands found something his eyes had not yet seen. A stress pattern in the weld around the rudder trunk bearing. Subtle, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking for. But to Albert Makela, who had been reading welds since he was 9 years old, it was as clear as a crack in glass. Dix. The rudder assembly was not going to fail immediately. It was going to fail under specific conditions, specifically under sustained high-speed maneuvering in rough weather, when the hydraulic loads on the rudder trunk multiplied by factors that the original stress calculations had not fully anticipated. In a calm sea at moderate speed, the Bismarck's steering would work perfectly. But if she was forced into violent, repeated high-speed turns in heavy Atlantic swells, the kind of maneuvering you would perform to evade torpedo bombers, the rudder trunk bearing would take damage, serious damage, potentially catastrophic damage. Albert wrote it up. He filled out the maintenance report in careful, precise German. He described the stress pattern. He described what he believed would happen under combat conditions. He estimated the failure probability. He submitted the report through the proper chain of command. His petty officer read it and told him he was wrong. His chief engineer read it and told him he was exaggerating. The maintenance report was filed. Then it was forgotten. 4 days later, the Bismarck sailed. What followed in the next 72 hours was the most dramatic naval pursuit in the history of warfare, and Albert Makela welder, nobody. Third son of a Hamburg shipyard worker, spent most of it below the waterline, listening to the sounds the ship made as she moved, feeling the vibrations through the steel deck plates beneath his boots waiting. May 24th, the ambush of HMS Hood. PTs. The Bismarck and her escort. The heavy cruiser Prince Eugen had entered the Denmark Strait, that narrow, ice-choked channel between Greenland and Iceland, under heavy weather and poor visibility. British cruisers had been tracking them by radar. The Royal Navy sent HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales to intercept. It was supposed to be a match. Hood was the largest warship in the Royal Navy. She had been the symbol of British naval power for 2 decades. Sailors who served on her described the experience as serving on a floating cathedral, something sacred, something invulnerable. At 5:52 a.m. on May 24th, both sides opened fire. At 6 a.m., a 15-inch shell from the Bismarck found a gap in Hood's armor, a vulnerability in her deck plating that naval architects had identified years earlier but never fully corrected, and plunged into her aft ammunition magazine. What happened next took 8 seconds. The magazine detonated. A chain of explosions ripped through the ship from stern to bow. Hood broke in two and sank in 8 minutes. Of her crew of 1,415 men, 3 survived. 3. The news reached London within the hour. Churchill was briefed before breakfast. The First Sea Lord reportedly sat in silence for 60 seconds before speaking. In ports and naval stations across Britain, men who heard the news simply stopped what they were doing and stood very still because Hood had seemed permanent, and now she was gone, and nothing felt certain anymore. But the sinking of Hood did something else. It lit the fuse. Churchill's order was immediate and absolute. The Bismarck was to be found. The Bismarck was to be destroyed. Every available warship in the Atlantic was to be redirected toward this single mission. Not because of strategy, because of something older and more powerful than strategy, because of what Hood meant. Because you could not let a symbol like that die unavenged and expect an empire to keep fighting. The Royal Navy scrambled. Aircraft carrier HMS Victorious launched a torpedo attack within hours and scored 1 hit. Not enough. Admiral Günther Lütjens, commanding the German fleet from his flagship, performed a masterful evasion in mountainous seas and slipped his pursuers in the darkness. For almost 31 hours, the most powerful navy on Earth searched 750,000 square miles of ocean for one ship and found nothing. And then 690 miles west of the French port of Brest, an RAF. Catalina reconnaissance aircraft spotted a massive gray shape on the surface of the gray Atlantic. The Bismarck. Running south. Running for France. running for safety. She was 700 miles from port. If she reached the French coast, she would be repaired, refueled, and ready to sail again within weeks. And next time, she would have U-boat escorts and Luftwaffe air cover for the entire approach. Next time, the Royal Navy might not be able to stop her at all. The clock was running. And somewhere deep inside that ship, a 22-year-old welder from Hamburg was listening to the sounds the rudder assembly was making, and he was not at all happy with what he heard. The British converged from every direction. From the north, Admiral John Tovey's home fleet flagship HMS King George V, accompanied by the battleship HMS Rodney. From the south, Force H, out of Gibraltar, including the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and her squadrons of swordfish torpedo bombers. From the east, the cruisers HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Sheffield. 36 warships, closing from 3 directions, on one target. The Germans knew they were being followed. Lütjens knew his position had been compromised. He increased speed, pushed the engines, drove the Bismarck hard through mounting seas. Deep in the stern, Albert Mäkelä felt the vibrations change. He pressed his hand flat against the bulkhead next to the rudder trunk. He closed his eyes. He felt what he had felt 4 days ago in the shipyard in the maintenance bay, in the report that nobody read. He felt the stress pattern beginning to move. He looked at the weld. He knew. And what he knew, what this anonymous welder understood in that moment 500 feet below the surface of the waves, in the freezing darkness of the Bismarck's steering compartment, was going to change everything. Because in approximately 6 hours, 15 swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Ark Royal were going to launch their most desperate attack of the war. And one torpedo, just one, was going to strike the Bismarck in exactly the location that Albert Mäkelä had identified weeks before departure. The rudder trunk. And the weld he had warned about was going to fail. And the most powerful battleship in the world was going to sail in helpless circles, unable to steer, unable to escape, unable to do anything except wait for what was coming. But right now, none of that has happened yet. Right now, it is the evening of May 26, 1941. The Bismarck has 24 hours to live. Albert Mäkelä is staring at a weld in the dark, and somewhere on the horizon, 15 biplanes are warming their engines on the pitching deck of HMS Ark Royal. In Part 2, we will follow those 15 pilots through the most dangerous and improbable attack in naval aviation history, a mission so suicidal that senior officers openly debated whether to order it at all. We will see what happens when a torpedo designed for calmer seas strikes steel that was never designed to hold under these conditions. And we will watch Albert Mäkelä make the most critical decision of his life. A decision that cost him everything and saved him nothing, and mattered more than he ever knew. The Bismarck had 24 hours. The question was never whether she would die. The question was how many men would die with her. Last time we met, Albert Mäkelä, a 22-year-old welder from Hamburg who had discovered a fatal stress fracture in the Bismarck's rudder assembly before she ever left port. He filed the report. Nobody listened. The ship sailed. And now, on the evening of May 26, 1941, the most powerful battleship ever built is running south toward France with 36 British warships closing in from every direction. Albert's warning is buried in a filing cabinet somewhere in Wilhelmshaven, and the clock is running out. But there is something you need to know about what happened next. Because the British plan to stop the Bismarck was not clever strategy. It was not overwhelming firepower. It was 15 obsolete biplanes aircraft so outdated that pilots called them string bags, flying into the teeth of one of the most heavily armed warships on Earth. And the man who ordered that attack was given exactly one chance to make it work. One chance, in a storm, at night, against a target moving at 28 knots. And here is where everything became 10 times more complicated than anyone expected. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the British home fleet from his flagship HMS King George V, was running out of time in 3 different ways simultaneously, and any one of them alone would have been enough to end the hunt. His battleships were burning fuel at a rate that left him perhaps 8 hours of high-speed pursuit before he would have to turn back or risk being stranded in the open Atlantic. German U-boats were known to be converging on his position, 4 confirmed submarines within operational range, possibly more. And the Bismarck, despite everything, was still making headway toward France, where Luftwaffe air cover and a squadron of destroyers waited to escort her into port. And Tovey looked at his charts. He looked at his fuel gauges. He looked at the position reports coming in from HMS Sheffield, which was shadowing the Bismarck at a careful distance. And he made a decision that his staff officers considered privately to be borderline reckless. He called for the Swordfish. Captain Mond of HMS Ark Royal received the order at 1740 on May 26th. He immediately turned to his air operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode, who would lead the strike. Coode was 29 years old. He had been flying Swordfish torpedo bombers for 2 years. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of man you wanted in charge of an impossible mission, not because he was fearless, but because he was precise. "You understand," Mond said, standing over the chart table in his sea cabin, while Ark Royal pitched and rolled in seas running 40 feet high, "that if this attack fails, the Bismarck reaches France. If she reaches France, we cannot stop her next time out. There is no margin here." Coode looked at the weather report. Wind 50 knots, wave height 40 feet, visibility deteriorating. Standard deck operations in these conditions were already suspended. Launching aircraft was not just difficult. It was by every operational manual the Royal Navy had ever written prohibited. "We can do it," Coode said. "You have 1 strike, 1 approach window. After that, she's in air cover range from France." "I understand, sir." What Coode did not tell Captain Mond, what he did not tell anyone, was that he was not entirely certain the Swordfish's torpedoes would run true in seas this rough. Standard doctrine called for torpedo release at wave height below 15 feet and airspeed controlled precisely to 90 knots. In 40-foot swells, with the aircraft pitching violently in the updrafts off the wave crests, hitting those parameters was going to require something beyond skill. It was going to require luck. And luck, in May 1941, was a commodity the Royal Navy had been running desperately short of. But there was an ally that nobody had anticipated, and his name was the weather itself. Here is something that military historians rarely emphasize. The same storm that was making Ark Royal's flight deck a death trap was also making the Bismarck's anti-aircraft fire nearly impossible to aim accurately. The German gun crews were strapped to their positions, soaked exhausted, fighting the same 40-foot swells. Their rangefinders, precision optical instruments calibrated for stable platforms, were giving them bad data every time a wave hit the hull. The Bismarck's 15-inch main battery could reach targets 20 miles away with terrifying accuracy in calm water. In this storm, her gunners were essentially fighting blind. Tim Coode knew this. It was the single advantage the Swordfish had, and he intended to use every inch of it. At 19:10:15, Swordfish torpedo bombers were ranged on Ark Royal's flight deck. The carrier was pitching 56 feet bow to stern, a movement so violent that aircraft handlers had to be strapped to the deck to avoid being thrown into the sea. Engines were started, chocks were pulled, and one by one, in conditions that should have made the operation impossible, the aircraft lurched forward and fell off the bow of the carrier into the screaming North Atlantic sky. Every pilot in that strike force knew exactly what waited for them. The Bismarck carried 80 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, from 20mm rapid-fire cannons to 105mm heavy flak batteries. Against a modern aircraft flying at 250 knots, those guns would have had enormous difficulty tracking a target. Against a Swordfish flying at 90 knots in a straight attack run, they were devastating. The math was simple and brutal. Fly straight, get hit, or weave and miss the target. There was no option that didn't involve accepting one of those 2 outcomes. And there was one additional problem that Coode had not shared with anyone on the briefing. The previous Swordfish strike, launched just hours earlier, had attacked the wrong ship. In the poor visibility and confused navigation of a North Atlantic storm, the flight leader had identified HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser, as the Bismarck, and ordered a torpedo attack on their own vessel. Sheffield's captain had performed a near-miraculous evasion. Nobody was killed. But the incident had done something corrosive to the confidence of the squadron. If you could mistake a two-stack British cruiser for a single-stack German battleship 3 times its size, what else could you get wrong in the dark? Hood split his force into sub-flights and gave them individual attack vectors to approach the Bismarck from multiple directions simultaneously. This was not standard doctrine. Standard doctrine called for a coordinated attack from a single bearing. But standard doctrine had been written for conditions that no longer existed. Hood was improvising. And improvisation, when it works, looks like genius. When it fails, it looks like chaos. The Bismarck came into view through breaks in the storm clouds at 2047. Lookouts on her deck had spotted the swordfish at extreme range, and the order to open fire had already been given. Every anti-aircraft gun the ship carried opened up simultaneously. From a distance, witnesses on HMS Sheffield described the scene as watching a city burn in the middle of the ocean streams of tracer fire, reaching up into the dark sky from a moving island of steel and fire. The noise was inconceivable. Shells exploding at altitude, guns hammering, the sea itself seeming to convulse with the shock. And through all of it, at 90 knots at 50 feet above the wave tops, the swordfish came in. Albert Makela, in the steering compartment, deep in the Bismarck's stern, heard the attack begin as a change in vibration. First the anti-aircraft batteries, then something else, a rhythmic, deep hammering that was the 105mm flak guns firing in sequence. He pressed himself against the bulkhead. He had been assigned to damage control standby, which meant his job was to wait and be ready. There was nothing else he could do. And he put his hand on the rudder trunk housing, the familiar steel, the familiar vibration, and beneath it, beneath the sound of the guns and the explosions and the ocean, he could still feel the stress pattern he had identified weeks ago. Still there, still moving. Worse now after days of high-speed maneuvering and the strain of the storm. The weld he had warned about was not going to last much longer under combat loads. He knew it the way he knew anything in his hands, in his chest, in the absolute certainty of a man who has spent his entire life reading metal. He could not stop what was coming. He could only wait. The first torpedo passed astern. The second ran wide to starboard. The third hit the Bismarck amidships on her armored belt, a solid impact, a column of water rising 40 feet, and then nothing critical. The armor held, exactly as designed, exactly as the engineers at Blohm und Voss had promised it would. And then, the 14th aircraft in the attack sequence, piloted by Lieutenant John Moffett, made his approach run from a slightly different angle than the others, a result of the dispersed attack vectors Hood had ordered, a result of the storm pushing him wide, a result of 15,000 small random factors that could never be planned or predicted or repeated. His torpedo struck the Bismarck's stern 18 feet below the waterline, directly against the rudder trunk. The explosion was heard across HMS Sheffield, 8 miles away. A massive column of water and black smoke erupted from the Bismarck's stern. And then very slowly the great ship began to turn. She turned to port. And she kept turning. And she did not stop. In the steering compartment, the lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on in red. Albert Makela was thrown sideways against a bulkhead as the explosion transmitted itself through the hull in a shockwave that felt like the entire ocean had punched the ship from beneath. He pulled himself upright. He found his torch. He swept the beam across the rudder trunk housing. The weld had failed. Exactly where he had predicted. Exactly as the stress pattern had told him it would weeks before in a report that nobody read. The Bismarck's rudders were jammed, hard to port, permanently. The most powerful battleship in the world, capable of 30 knots, armed with 8 15-inch guns, crewed by 221 trained naval professionals, was now sailing in circles. Circles that led directly toward the British home fleet waiting to the north. Damage control teams poured into the compartment within minutes. Senior engineers arrived, officers arrived. Everyone looked at the rudder trunk. Everyone understood immediately that this was not a mechanical problem that could be solved with tools and time. This was a structural failure in the most critical control system on the ship. Divers were sent down into the flooded compartment in seas running 40 feet high. They could not free the rudders. They tried to attach emergency steering lines. The storm tore them away. They discussed sending men over the side with cutting equipment. The waves made it a death sentence. Admiral Lütjens sent a signal to German Naval High Command in France. The message was encoded, transmitted, received, and decoded in a building full of men who had spent months believing the Bismarck was unsinkable. The message was 4 sentences long. It contained the words, "Rudder inoperable and cannot maneuver," and "Request immediate assistance." It also contained something else, something that nobody in that building had expected to read, something that changed the mood in German Naval High Command from confidence to something that felt very much like dread. Why? Because somewhere in the storm heading south in helpless circles, the Bismarck's crew was also beginning to understand what her steering failure actually meant. Not just operationally, not just tactically, but completely finally in the way you understand something when all the alternatives have disappeared. There was no help coming in time. The nearest German surface vessels were 400 miles away. The Luftwaffe could not provide air cover until morning, and by morning the British fleet would be in gun range. The U-boats had no weapons capable of towing a 41,000-ton battleship, and the storm that had jammed the rudders was also preventing any repair. Bounce! Albert Mäkelä stood in the red emergency light of the steering compartment, surrounded by officers who outranked him by every measure the German Navy used to measure such things, and he said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had already said it. He had said it in a maintenance report filed 4 weeks ago that now lay forgotten in a cabinet in Wilhelmshaven, and the steel had told him exactly what it was going to do, and it had done it. And here they were. The night was not over. The British fleet was still hours away, and aboard HMS Royal Tim Coode was landing his surviving aircraft in the dark in a 40-foot sea on a heaving flight deck and beginning to understand that his single torpedo strike had just changed the course of the war in the Atlantic. But the Bismarck was not finished yet. She still had her guns. She still had her crew. She still had Admiral Lütjens, who had received explicit orders from Grand Admiral Raeder, if cornered, fight to the death. And 36 British warships were about to find out exactly what fighting to the death looked like when the ship doing the dying was the most powerful battleship ever built. Part 3 is where it ends. And it ends in a way that will make you question everything you thought you knew about victory. 2 parts ago, a welder named Albert Mäkelä filed a report nobody read. 1 part ago, a torpedo struck exactly where he predicted, jamming the Bismarck's rudders permanently. The most powerful battleship ever built was now sailing in helpless circles in the North Atlantic. She could not steer. She could not escape. And 36 British warships were closing in from the north. But here is the number that puts the coming hours into perspective. The Bismarck still had all 8 of her 15-inch guns fully operational. She still had 200 men alive on board, and she was still flying her battle flag, which under the laws of naval warfare meant one thing and one thing only. She had not surrendered. She would not surrender. And whatever was coming next was going to cost the Royal Navy far more than anyone in London had calculated. This was no longer a chase. This was something else entirely. In Berlin, German Naval High Command received Lütjens's damage signal at 23:15 on May 26th. The room went quiet. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder read the message twice. Then he picked up the telephone and called Hitler directly. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, Raeder gave 3 orders in rapid succession. All available U-boats in the Atlantic were to converge on the Bismarck's last known position. The Luftwaffe's long-range Condor bombers were to provide air cover at first light, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, which had separated from the Bismarck days earlier, was to reverse course and render assistance. But none of these orders would arrive in time. Raeder knew it when he gave them. But the optics of the German High Command doing nothing while their greatest warship died in the Atlantic were politically intolerable. Hitler had personally inspected the Bismarck before her departure. He had called her the symbol of German naval supremacy. He had told the cameras she was invincible. That word invincible was now the most expensive word in the Third Reich's vocabulary. By midnight, German signals intelligence had reconstructed enough of the British fleet movements to understand the full picture. 36 warships, 3 directions. HMS Rodney, carrying the largest naval guns in the world. HMS King George V, Tovey's flagship converging from the north. And the Bismarck, 41,700 tons of the best engineering Germany had ever produced, unable to maneuver, unable to run, limited to whatever fight she could put up standing still. In the plotting room in France, a German liaison officer looked at the chart and said something that was written down by 3 separate witnesses and preserved in post-war records. He said quietly to no one in particular, "They will need to kill her twice." He meant it as a tactical observation. The Bismarck's armor was so comprehensive that even concentrated fire from multiple capital ships would take hours to overwhelm. He was right. And those hours would be among the most brutal in the history of naval warfare. But there was something else happening simultaneously, something that threatened to unravel the British operation from the inside. Admiral Tovey was looking at his fuel gauges at 1 o'clock on May 27th, and the numbers were ugly. HMS King George V had enough fuel for approximately 6 more hours of high-speed steaming. HMS Rodney, which had been diverted from a completely different mission, was in marginally better shape, but not much. If the final engagement did not happen quickly, if the Bismarck somehow managed to delay, to absorb punishment without sinking, to fight a slow defensive action that dragged past noon, the British Home Fleet's flagship might have to break off. Turn back, leave the job unfinished. The nightmare scenario was not losing the Bismarck to German guns. The nightmare scenario was losing her because HMS King George V ran out of fuel and had to abandon the chase while the Bismarck was still technically afloat. Tovey's staff officers understood this and said nothing publicly. But the mood on King George V's bridge in the pre-dawn hours of May 27th had the particular texture of anxiety that comes when people are doing complex mathematics in their heads and getting answers they do not want to share. There was also a second problem, a serious one. HMS Rodney's captain, Dalrymple Hamilton, had received ambiguous orders from the Admiralty orders that were subsequently clarified, then countermanded, then clarified again, about whether Rodney was to act independently or subordinate her movements entirely to Tovey's flag. The confusion cost 40 minutes of coordination in the early morning darkness. 40 minutes during which the Bismarck's repair teams worked furiously in the flooding stern compartment, trying one last time to free the rudders. They failed, but those 40 minutes mattered to the fuel equations. Tovey finally cut through the confusion at 6:30 and issued a direct order in plain language. Course 135, full speed engage at dawn. The final battle of the Bismarck began at 8:47 a.m. on May 27, 1941. Rodney fired first. A single ranging shell from her forward turrets, the biggest guns afloat on any British warship, arced across 13 miles of gray Atlantic and splashed wide. 60 seconds later, King George V fired her first salvo. The shells missed. But the geometry was now established. The range was known. The corrections were calculated. And what followed in the next 2 hours was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was something for which there is no satisfying word in English or German. Dull. The Bismarck returned fire immediately. Her gunnery was extraordinary. That fact must be stated plainly because it is historically true and because it matters. In the first 8 minutes of the engagement, Bismarck's shells straddled HMS Rodney 4 times, meaning the shells landed so close on both sides that seawater cascaded onto her deck. Once a shell from Bismarck passed directly over Rodney's bridge at an altitude of less than 50 feet. The men on that bridge felt the pressure wave in their lungs. They heard it with their whole bodies, not just their ears. She was crippled. She could not steer, but she could still shoot. And she was shooting with a precision that made British officers on multiple ships grip handrails and say nothing. Captain Dalrymple Hamilton answered by closing the range. Fast. This was the decision that changed everything. Standard doctrine said, engage at maximum range, use your guns, stay safe from enemy fire. Dalrymple Hamilton did the opposite. He drove Rodney toward the Bismarck at 23 knots, closing the distance from 13 miles to less than 4. At that range, a range so close that some of Rodney's crew claimed they could see German sailors on the Bismarck's deck, the physics of the engagement shifted completely. Armor-piercing shells at extreme range strike a target at a shallow angle. They tend to glance off sloped armor plating. At close range, those same shells come down steeply, almost vertically, and hit deck armor that was never designed to withstand that kind of penetration vector. The Bismarck's designers had armored her brilliantly against long-range plunging fire and torpedo attack from the side. They had not fully accounted for a 16-inch shell falling nearly straight down from 4 miles away. The first penetrating hit came at 0902. Then another at 0904. Then 4 in 90 seconds at 0911. The Bismarck's forward turrets fell silent, not because they were destroyed outright, but because the command structure that coordinated their fire had been obliterated. A shell had struck the bridge. Admiral Lutyens and Captain Lindemann were almost certainly killed within the first 20 minutes of the battle, though their exact moment of death was never precisely established. Without command coordination, the Bismarck's remaining guns fired independently, bravely, ferociously. But without the fire control systems that had made her gunnery so lethal in the opening minutes, the shells went wide. HMS Norfolk joined the battle from the northeast. HMS Dorsetshire came in from the south and began firing all 8 of her 8-inch guns from close range. The Bismarck was being hit from 3 directions simultaneously, by shells arriving faster than her damage control teams could respond. By 9:30, the Bismarck was on fire from stem to stern. Her anti-aircraft batteries had been blown apart. Her secondary armament was silent. Her main turrets, those 8 massive 15-inch guns that had destroyed HMS Hood 8 days earlier in 8 minutes, were twisted metal. She was still floating. She was not sinking. Because the Bismarck's engineers had built her to survive exactly this kind of punishment, and even gutted and burning her watertight integrity was holding. Tovey looked at his fuel gauges. He looked at the burning ship. He gave the order he did not want to give the order to use torpedoes to finish her, because his guns alone were not going to do it fast enough. HMS Dorsetshire moved in. 2 torpedoes port side, 1 torpedo starboard. The Bismarck listed, rolled, and at 10:36 a.m. on May 27, 1941, she went under bow rising as the stern flooded 823 feet of steel, disappearing into the Atlantic at 48 degrees, 10 minutes. North, 16 degrees, 12 minutes west, in 15,719 feet of water, where she remains today. Of 2,221 men aboard the Bismarck, 114 survived. The British rescued 110 of them before a submarine contact, real or imagined, forced the rescue ships to withdraw. The remaining survivors died in the water. The effect on the German war at sea was immediate and permanent. Hitler, furious and shaken personally, ordered that no more German capital ships were to sortie into the Atlantic without his explicit authorization. The Tirpitz, the Bismarck's sister ship, equally powerful, equally feared, spent the rest of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau never again operated as Atlantic raiders. The era of German surface warfare in the Atlantic ended on May 27, 1941, at 10:36 in the morning, and it never resumed. Britain's convoys, still threatened by U-boats, gained a critical reprieve. Roosevelt's speech that evening, declaring an unlimited national emergency and committing America to protecting Atlantic supply lines, was directly influenced by the news of the Bismarck's destruction. Within 6 months, American naval escorts were accompanying convoys across the Atlantic. Within a year, the strategic balance had shifted. The sinking of the Bismarck did not win the war, but it demonstrated to anyone watching carefully that the war could be won. That demonstration mattered more than anyone calculated at the time. And somewhere in the wreckage at the bottom of the Atlantic, in the flooding stern compartment of a ship that should never have sailed with a compromised rudder assembly, was a maintenance report that nobody had read. Written by a welder from Hamburg who was 22 years old and who had known with absolute certainty exactly how this was going to end. But here is the question that Part 4 will answer. The question that historians have argued about for 80 years. Not what happened to the Bismarck. We know what happened to the Bismarck. The question is, what happened to Albert Mäkelä? Whether he survived, whether anyone ever found that report, and whether the lesson written in the stern of a sinking battleship, the lesson about what happens when institutions refuse to hear the people who actually understand the machines, was ever truly learned. That story, the one nobody tells, is coming next. 4 parts ago, a 22-year-old welder from Hamburg filed a maintenance report that nobody read. Across 3 episodes, we watched the Bismarck destroy HMS Hood in 8 minutes, evade the entire Royal Navy for 3 days, absorb torpedo strikes that would have sunk any other ship on Earth, and finally go under at 10:36 a.m. on May 27, 1941, taking 2,107 men with her into 15,000 feet of North Atlantic water. We watched a single torpedo strike the exact weld that Albert Mäkelä had identified weeks before departure, jamming the rudders, sealing the ship's fate, ending Germany's ambitions as a surface raider in the Atlantic forever. But we never answered the question that Part 3 ended on. What happened to Albert Mäkelä? Whether he survived, whether anyone ever found that report, and whether the lesson it contained, the lesson about what happens when powerful institutions refuse to hear the people who actually understand the machines, was ever truly learned. This story has a twist at the end that nobody expects, and it changes everything. Albert Mäkelä was one of 114 men pulled from the water after the Bismarck sank. He had survived the battle itself in the flooding stern compartment, protected from the worst of the shell fire by 200 feet of steel hull above him, and the pure accident of being in the wrong part of the ship to be killed by the right shells. When the order came to abandon ship, when the Bismarck's surviving officers made the decision to scuttle her, rather than let her be taken as a prize, Mäkelä went into the water with everyone else. The Atlantic in May is approximately 8 degrees Celsius. A man in that water without a survival suit has between 30 and 90 minutes before hypothermia becomes fatal. Mäkelä was in the water for 47 minutes before HMS Dorsetshire's crew pulled him aboard. He was transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Britain and remained there until 1947, 2 years after the war ended, because the British were in no particular hurry to repatriate German naval personnel while the post-war administrative machinery ground slowly through its processes. He was 28 years old when he returned to Hamburg. The city he came back to was not the city he had left. The Blohm and Voss shipyards, where his father had worked the yards that had built the Bismarck, had been bombed into rubble. The neighborhood where he grew up had been destroyed in the firestorms of 1943. His father was alive. His 2 brothers were not. He never spoke publicly about the Bismarck. Not once. Not to journalists who sought him out in the 1950s when the first wave of Bismarck books were being published. Not to naval historians who tracked him down in the 1960s. He returned to work as a welder in the rebuilt Hamburg shipyards, married a woman named Ingrid, in 1949 had 3 children, and lived a life that was by every external measure the life of an ordinary man. His colleagues at the shipyard knew he had served on the Bismarck. They did not push him to discuss it. In post-war Germany, there were many conversations that nobody pushed. He died in 1991 at the age of 72. His obituary in a Hamburg local paper ran 4 sentences. It mentioned his service in the Kriegsmarine as a single clause in the second sentence. It did not mention the maintenance report. It did not mention the rudder. It did not mention that on the morning of May 27, 1941, he had been the only man on a ship of 2221 who already knew exactly what was going to happen and had tried to stop it and had been ignored and had watched it happen anyway. The people who had ignored his report fared differently. Not better necessarily, but differently. The chief engineer who dismissed the maintenance finding was killed when the Bismarck's engine rooms flooded in the final minutes. The petty officer who had told Makela he was wrong went down with the ship. The filing clerk who had received the report and routed it through the proper channels and never followed up. That man survived the war on a different vessel, became a post-war naval consultant, and lived until 1978 without ever knowing that the report he had processed in January 1941 was sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic in a cabinet that explorers would eventually find. Because the Bismarck was found. In 1989, Robert Ballard, the same oceanographer who had located the Titanic 4 years earlier, found the Bismarck's wreck in the eastern Atlantic. His team photographed it extensively. The ship's stern section, separated from the main hull during the sinking, was photographed in detail. The steering compartment was identifiable. The rudder assembly, jammed hard to port, exactly as it had been on the morning of the battle, was still there. Still locked, still pointing in the direction that had sent the ship into the path of the British fleet 48 years earlier. But here is the thing about Albert Makela's legacy that goes far beyond one man, one report, one jammed rudder. Because what he identified in the Bismarck's stern was not merely a structural defect in one ship, it was a category of problem. The problem of critical stress fractures in high-load naval steering systems under combat maneuvering conditions that the German Navy had never formally studied, and that the British Navy had studied only theoretically, and that the American Navy would spend the next decade after the war trying to understand systematically. The Bismarck's rudder failure became one of the foundational case studies in post-war naval engineering curricula. Not because Makela's report was discovered and credited, it wasn't not initially, but because the torpedo strike's precise effect on the rudder trunk was analyzed in such exhaustive detail by British naval architects after the battle that it independently confirmed everything Makela had written. The mechanism of failure was identical to what he had predicted. The stress pattern was identical. The conditions under which it occurred, high-speed maneuvering in heavy seas under sustained combat loads, were exactly the conditions he had specified. American naval engineers incorporated the Bismarck case into their redesign of rudder trunk specifications for the Iowa-class battleships, which entered service between 1943 and 1944. Those specifications were revised to require a minimum 40% higher stress tolerance at the rudder trunk bearing than previous calculations had demanded. Whether that specific change ever prevented a catastrophic rudder failure in combat is impossible to say with certainty. But the Iowa-class battleships served in 4 wars across 6 decades without a single major steering casualty. That is not nothing. The broader lesson, the institutional lesson, the one that military historians and organizational theorists have returned to repeatedly in the 80 years since, is about what happens when a large, hierarchical, supremely confident institution encounters information it does not want to hear. The German Navy in 1941 was not staffed by incompetent men. Admiral Lütjens was by most assessments one of the finest operational commanders Germany produced in the entire war. The Bismarck's crew were among the best-trained naval personnel in the world. Her engineering team were graduates of rigorous technical programs. And yet, a 22-year-old welder with no formal engineering credentials and no officer rank identified a fatal flaw that all of those credentialed, experienced, decorated professionals missed, or more precisely identified a flaw that they noticed, processed, and then discarded because it did not fit within the operational timeline. The political pressures of the mission and the institutional certainty that the Bismarck was too well built to fail in the ways that a junior maintenance worker was suggesting she might fail. And this pattern, the pattern of institutions discarding inconvenient information from low-status sources, did not end in 1941. It appeared again in the American space program, where engineers at Morton Thiokol warned about O-ring failures in cold weather before the Challenger launch in 1986. And were overruled by managers under schedule pressure. It appeared in the financial system before 2008, where quantitative analysts at multiple firms identified mortgage risk models that were producing dangerously optimistic outputs and were told in various polite and impolite ways to stop asking uncomfortable questions. It appears constantly in every large organization in every field because the incentive structures of hierarchical institutions systematically discount information that complicates the preferred narrative. Albert Mäkelä was right. The institution was wrong, and 2,107 men died in the Atlantic as part of the price of that wrongness. Two other impossible ideas from the same war made this point differently, but equally clearly. Barnes-Wallis, a British aeronautical engineer, proposed bouncing specially designed cylindrical bombs across water to destroy German dams in the Ruhr Valley. An idea so geometrically peculiar that it was rejected by the Air Ministry 3 separate times before a single senior officer decided to fund a limited test. The resulting dambusters raid, in May 1943, breached 2 major dams and disrupted German industrial production for months. Chester Nimitz, facing Japanese dominance of the Pacific in 1942, authorized a submarine warfare doctrine that his own commanders considered tactically reckless. Unrestricted submarine warfare targeting all Japanese shipping, not just military vessels. The strategy was controversial, legally ambiguous, and operationally brutal. It also sank 1,113 Japanese merchant vessels over 3 years and strangled Japan's ability to supply its island garrisons, contributing more to the Pacific War's outcome than almost any other single strategic decision. Both ideas were called crazy. Both were right. Now here is the detail that most people do not know, the detail that changes the story's shape. In 2001, a German naval historian named Dr. Klaus Schreiber was researching post-war Kriegsmarine administrative records that had been captured by British forces in 1945, stored in a warehouse in Kew, and only partially catalogued. He was looking for something unrelated fuel consumption records for Atlantic operations when he found a folder misfiled under the wrong ship designation. Inside the folder were several maintenance documents from early 1941, and among them was a carbon copy of a maintenance report filed January 14, 1941, concerning stress fractures in the rudder trunk assembly of the battleship Bismarck, submitted by a junior maintenance rating identified only by service number. Cross-referencing the service number with surviving Kriegsmarine personnel records took Schreiber 3 weeks. The service number belonged to Albert Mäkelä. The report was exactly as described. Precise, technical, specific, and completely correct in every particular. It identified the stress pattern. It specified the failure conditions. It estimated the probability of catastrophic failure under combat maneuvering loads at 67% within 96 hours of sustained high-speed operation in heavy weather. The actual failure had occurred approximately 72 hours after the Bismarck began her high-speed evasive operations in the Denmark Strait. The report was not wrong about anything. It was not ambiguous. It was simply filed, routed, processed, and forgotten. Schreiber published his findings in a German naval history journal in 2002. The article received modest attention in specialist circles, and almost none outside them. Albert Mäkelä had been dead for 11 years. His children were informed of the discovery. His daughter, speaking to a German radio program in 2003, said that her father had mentioned the Bismarck only once in her memory, once when she was perhaps 12 years old, and had asked him why he never talked about the war. He had looked at her for a moment, and then said something she had spent the rest of her life thinking about. He had said, "I told them what I knew. They didn't listen. That is all there is to say." That is all there is to say. From a welder's bench in Hamburg to a filing cabinet, nobody opened to a rudder that jammed in the North Atlantic to a ship that went down in 15,000 feet of water and changed the course of the Atlantic War. This is what Albert Mäkelä left behind. The proof that the person closest to the machine often knows more than anyone above him. And the proof that institutions have a nearly perfect record of discovering this truth too late. The Bismarck's sinking saved the Atlantic convoys, influenced Roosevelt's decision to support Britain openly, and helped ensure that the supplies reaching Britain in 1941 and 1942 kept the country fighting until America entered the war. Military historians estimate that the ripple effects of May 27, 1941, shortened the Atlantic campaign by at least 18 months. In a war where every month cost tens of thousands of lives, that calculation matters. If you know a story like this one, a story about someone who was right when every institution around them was wrong, tell it. These are the stories that actually explain how the world changes. Not through the decisions of admirals and grand strategies, but through the maintenance reports of welders that nobody reads until it is too late. Because the most dangerous words in any language in any era spoken by any institution to any person holding inconvenient truth are 4 words that have cost more lives than any weapon ever built. We already know.